Good evening, everyone, and welcome to Geopolitics with Tyberius D. And today we're going to be talking about Chinese geopolitical history and from how they got to where they started to where they are today. Definitely check this one out. It's going to be a fun one. Roll the intro. I hope you all are doing well. It's been a quick second since we've been doing everything, but we're trying a new schedule here on Twitch because a lot of people have been really upset that I'm just not streaming consistently, and it's just a shot in the dark. Sometimes I'm in the morning, sometimes in the night, and I fucked that up. Okay, anyway, without further ado, today, you edited that intro yourself. No, that was my good friend Samantha Banana that did that. I am not a graphics artist. Well, okay. I do my own graphics except for the video intros. I've still got Taze and Samantha that are working on that. But everything else is done. But we should be getting a new one here soon. Either way, it's dope. I know, it's great, ain't it? All right, so without further ado, today we're going to be talking about China. I already talked about that in the intro. The last episode in geopolitics, we talked about where China is today, how their economy is absolutely massive, and that they're doing not necessarily great, but they're doing pretty well for themselves, especially compared to their history. Well, today we're going to talk about that history and where it went good. Where basically, it's the good, the bad, and the ugly. So let's start with a little bit of good, and then we'll crash into the bad real quick. The good is that we want to start with the history with the Ming. And more particularly the collapse. Now, for anyone who doesn't really know much about the Ming, China was the first to invent gunpowder. They were the first to invent paper, and that actually goes into the prior dynasty before the Ming to some degree. But the Ming is basically the medieval era of China, China on high. And China does very, very well for quite a quick minute there. I see dogs are fighting. Sorry. Or not fighting, they're playing. They're having an argument, actually. Excuse me. Anyway, China during the medieval ages is doing pretty well. And when I say medieval ages, the Ming are pretty much on high in the 12 to 1400s. They'll start going into collapse really by 1500 outright. And this is because China becomes incredibly unstable, and on top of that, the Ming become this massive bureaucratic mess that, that largely just begins to eat itself socially, politically, and economically. I don't know why that's going on, but okay. Anyway, so getting back to where this all started, Chinese history is kind of weird, but I'm going to surmise everything before the Ming in a really weird nutshell. Chinese history is largely this thing where they come together and they grow and expand, and then they come together and then they grow and expand, and it's weird because it's not like what we see in Western history where you have somebody kind of come on high for a quick second and then it breaks up after a while, and then literally it's just a bunch of splinter states constantly going at it, such as the Kingdom of Hungary or the Kingdom of Poland or the Kingdom of whatever form Germany's taking at the damn time. It's very rare in the West that we've actually united under one banner. You know, Rome, as an example, is pretty much the only time we've done it in a massive sustained way. China, India, Japan all have this thing where they unite on a fundamental level way better and way more often. And so you have, just in the general theme work you have in China, most of Chinese history and most of Indian history, they're 25% of the economy each of the entire world just by themselves. But this is not an economy out of prosperity normally as much as that is an economy out of scale. While the India subcontinent is not huge by any example, is that usually it's had a robust, sizable population that has been able to marshal its resources into becoming some of the most powerful states that human history has had over the last 4,000 years. China has kind of the same thing, in that to a large degree they kind of have this perpetual thing where they unite under a similar banner. While the territory isn't exactly the same, the outline is that you largely have the Chinese core, which we'll talk about here later, that is the core of the Chinese Empire, and then it goes in the extremities. And what we usually see, but not always, because their history is really convoluted, is that whenever the Chinese core is in charge, the people that we now know as the Han Chinese are basically expanding and colonizing everywhere around them. And the reason why this happens is that the Chinese core doesn't look like the European core, and it doesn't even look like the Indian core to a large degree. And it gets into the question, probably because geography, not so much their culture, I would say, but I could be wrong. So the reason why Chinese history is so much different than Western history is because China, if you look on a topographical map, and you know what, I want to bring this up. We're going to do some more visual aid work going into this. I'm sorry, just bringing this up real quick. I know I'm not prepared for this, but it's one of those deals to where I want to show this more than I'm just talking about it for some folks. And that's the way to do it. So we're just going to pull this up real quick. It's not a really good image, but it is an image nonetheless. Let's see if I can zoom in. Hell yeah. All right, cool. So without further ado, we're going to switch over to that. So here's the thing. This map lacks quite a bit of detail. Especially in there, because when you look at these general areas here off to the side, is that, oh, and I'm sorry, I forgot, this is actually going on the podcast, that's why I usually don't show visual examples. When you look into the Chinese core, that is the green area on this map. Now, if you can't see this is the area that largely borders the Chinese coast around the Yellow Sea and the East China Sea. And so everything north of Shanghai up to Beijing, and then largely there's a triangle that forms out here, is that this is the core of China. But you can even see within that triangle, there's some hills and some mountainous areas that kind of divide it all up. And what basically Chinese history is that the people within the core had to unite as a functional entity under the same aegis. And eventually this is the rise of the Han Chinese people as we know them today. And eventually, once they united under the core, they start going into the hinterland regions, and they start trying to colonize everything around them. This is Manchuria, this is the areas that we now know as Inner Mongolia, and this is southern China, respectively. There's still a massive reason to why we see the difference between Cantonese and Mandarin, is that even though the script is the same, the dialect and the language kind of is different, and that is largely, it's a holdover of its own geography. Once you get south of the Hanghe, or I believe it's the Yellow River, don't quote me on that one, but south of the Hanghe River, it gets really mountainous and really hilly, and you just get a bunch of series of valleys that are far harder to police and far harder to integrate into the Union itself. Now, China has largely done this to a large degree, where those people think of themselves as Chinese, but maintaining a central authority from the Chinese core is really hard here because geography largely insulates it. The reason why modern China has kind of taken off is that they now have the technology and the infrastructure to build the infrastructure to unite them. And this is part of the whole high-speed rail program that they're doing. This is the highway system that they built out. This is the railroads that they built out. Before any of these were a thing, you literally had to walk with a backpack and a mule. And that is why Chinese history is significantly different geographically versus like the European history. Is that in the European history, you can literally walk from Paris to Berlin to Moscow, and there's not really a lot in your way outside of a forest here or there. When you get into China writ large, is that it's a lot more hilly, it's a lot more divided, and you can fortify and sink in. And so you get these pushes for unity among the Chinese people writ large every about 400 to 500 years, what largely happens is that anyone who isn't in charge gets into these hinterlands and they just hunker down and they fight them off as long as they possibly can. What the Chinese have actually done is they largely have colonized and ethnically cleansed anyone who didn't agree with them. And this is how you get Han China as a massive thing. And you can still see this today with this principle. The Manchus have been pretty much destroyed as a people and largely have been colonized, particularly after the 1940s going into the 1950s, because China didn't want the Qing running over again. Osiris, good to see you in chat. Mongolia largely has always tried to be subjugated, but they've never been able to roll people in. But of course today, if you're looking at it in the news, put it in Uyghurstan or Xinjiang or East Turkestan, whatever you want to call the area, it's openly being ethnically cleansed by re-education camps and culturally destroyed. You also have the same thing with Tibet, although it's quite a bit different in the regards that the Chinese are just moving Han Chinese people into the area to basically set up shop. And so this is kind of China's MO for the last 4 or 5,000 years, is that whoever is in charge moves their stuff in and tries to ethnically conquer the area. And China is one of the most racist and ethnocentric countries that you have ever seen in human history. And to say that that isn't true today, people need to learn their history. Is that they make the Nazis look pretty nasty too. That did not come out right. What I'm trying to say is that they are comparable to the Nazis in some serious ways, and people really discredit that. Because that becomes xenophobia and all this other shit. But it's true, and we need to be on that point. Okay, let's get back to the Ming. So the Ming largely, in what ways? I kind of just explained that. In a lot of ways, is that the Chinese, it will openly try to make you a second-class citizen if you do not report to be Han Chinese or if you don't meet the qualifications. And as I was talking about, true. Okay, everyone's starting to show up. Let's go. Good to see you, Loki. Or Yori. Anyway, what the Chinese largely do is that they just, if you're not Chinese or the area is not Chinese, either they will try to curtail you by cutting off resources to you and basically trying to police you. Very similar to what the Anglos would have done, or what the Europeans would have done, or the Anglos would have done in regards to just putting people in a box and kind of letting them stagnate. The Chinese have definitely done that, but also what they will do is in a time of population density and prosperity, when they don't have massive famines, they will literally pick up entire swaths of the Chinese population and move them into your land, and they will ethnically beat you out. Okay, I'm just going to ignore chat for a second. Holy crap. Yeah, they'll ethnically swarm you, and they'll just drown you out as an ethnicity, to the point where you have bred into they'll have bred you into the population popular, or you just don't exist anymore. Is that similar to perhaps certain grouping we see in the U.S. due to social engineering? That is a very hot topic. I don't want to make this what's going on in the U.S. But let's hit that let's do an AMA after the episode, and just remind me to do that, because this is China focused and I don't want to overly get into the United States. But I do have some serious conflict or serious opinions on what's going on there. Okay, so we'll table that. Getting into where we are, or going forward, is that going forward, you have the Ming, and the Ming were on high during basically the medieval era of Europe, and so everyone's on parity going into like 1300, 1400, even though you have the Black Death and whatever. About 1400, everyone's on the same page. Europeans are doing pretty well for themselves, recovering. They're still trying to put themselves together after the Black Death, but to a large degree, they're succeeding. You have the Middle East under the rule of the Ottoman Empire, which is rapidly expanding and getting very powerful. You have You have the Persians, which are doing pretty well, and you have another Indian kingdom. What largely happens is that about 1500, Europe just goes on escape velocity. And we'll get back to this because this leads into the century of humiliation. But while China is imploding, Europe is having this kind of renovation that will allow them to start dominating the planet, even while fighting each other. And that's absolutely amazing in terms of history, because that's never really happened before. So, going forward, China has another area or another time where it breaks down. To the Ming, the mandate of heaven is lost, and eventually somebody comes in to try to take over. It takes quite a while. You have another more or less warring states period, another jostling of political power, and eventually you get into it's either the Qing or the Qing, and it's spelled Qing. But the problem is that we romanticize letters, and I fucking hate this. But the way that we spell things in English doesn't mean it sounds that way when we're talking about it. And a great example is the Zhou. We spell it Zhou, which makes no damn sense. But anyway, going into this is that eventually after the Ming, you will get the rise of the Qing. Now, the Qing are not Han Chinese. They are Manchus. And this is the rise of the Manchu kingdoms up in Manchuria. And we call these people the Manchurians today, even though they've largely been wiped out. Excuse me. They largely come in. They're able to assert their power over the normalcy of China because it had absolutely imploded, and the Chinese were feuding amongst themselves. So they're able to build up unopposed for a while, and then once they get a chance, they kind of roll into China and they just steamroll everybody. And you get literally the biggest Chinese empire that we had ever seen to date. There's a concept about the tributary system, which is really weird, but the entire modern borders of China are within this empire, except for like a few parts in India and Vietnam. There's a few border skirmishes there. But to a large degree, modern China is in this, including Taiwan. You have all of Mongolia as part of this empire. You have a little place that used to be known as Tanatuva and now Russia. And the Koreans were, at minimum, either a subjugatory state or kind of a state entirely made into China. And the reason why I bring this up is because this is where Chinese history starts going to crap for them. The Manchus will do pretty well for a while ruling China, but then eventually somebody shows up. And, of course, that somebody is the Europeans. There's a long and a short to be had here, but the short version of it is that the Europeans start showing up as traders in the 1600s and the 1700s. And, at first they're just trading, anything that they can, which is, they have these new things, which is while the Chinese invented gunpowder, the Europeans at this point have muskets, and the Chinese have nothing to compete with this. There is some trade that goes on, but there's not a lot there's not enough technological diffusion to where the Qing are able to really pick up this and industrialize in the same way that the Europeans have been able to do with, with deep water navigation, with new metallurgy practices and new societal developments. I'm going to be honest here. There's definitely a question in me whether some of the more Enlightenment and liberal principles that come out of the Enlightenment do have a effect on the Europeans going pretty much in escape velocity. So that's a conversation for another day. But largely what we have here is that the traders get into East Asia as we know it. And for a while, it doesn't really go horribly because it builds out new relationships. The Europeans are here because they want access to trade. And of course, China is the end-all be-all. This is the origin of the Silk Road. So they want Chinese silk, they want China, they want spices, they want anything that's actually within the empire itself. And they're largely able to get it for a bit. The problem that happens within about 100 years after they show up is that the Europeans start getting closer and closer, and they start coming more and more in force. And to give you a kind of idea of what's going on here, 1700, the Europeans are largely worried about Europe, North America, and India. And no one's really got control of India at all. A lot of that's just among the trade companies that are still controlling that. North America is still largely uncolonized, outside of what hasn't been just taken over by the Spanish. And so you have like a few areas of colonies. And then Europe is still kind of recovering from the 30 Years' War and the Protestant Reformation and the major splits and schisms that's going on in Europe. Move that to 1800, and Europe is in a completely different spot. You have the United States is now North America's not only been settled, the United States is formed as a country. Most of India has now been brought under the British hegemony of the British East India Company, which is kind of an aegis for the British. And Europe is getting, at this point, we'll be getting into the Napoleonic Wars, which is where Europe literally starts operating on a global scale in terms of the era of empires. And so, in a nutshell, what happens largely by this point is that the Europeans are able to bring in some serious muscle coming forward. And this leads into what we now know, or for the Chinese, is the century of humiliation. Because while China has a massive amount of power behind it, because it's huge, it's not a billion people then, it's estimated somewhere between 300 and 500 million people that would have been in China at this point, and it depends on when we're talking about. But in a general sense here, is that the Europeans keep the Europeans keep showing up more and more and more and more. And what eventually happens is two things. One, the Chinese get incredibly ethnocentric, which is kind of part of the course for their history. They start barring the Europeans out because they see them as a threat and an influence that they don't want. This doesn't go well because the Europeans want the trade that's going in from China, and eventually there's a lot of racketeering, there's a lot of smuggling, there's a lot of X, Y, and Z. Sometimes it's openly sponsored by... I feel your pain, Robo. I really do. I've got some math homework over there I need to deal with. But anyway, sorry, to put this in perspective, is that the Chinese are getting wealthy off of this trade, so they don't want to ignore it. And it gets to this weird point where there's some gish galloping between where the Chinese want it, where the Europeans want it, and eventually it starts getting into fights. A few times it's just the Europeans are able to bring in some bigger ships and kind of force the issue on a small scale, but then the Qing openly start going and start trying to set terms as a pejorative to show their real power. And this largely comes out in the 1840s. Now, again, the 1840s, still largely the age of sail, still largely the age of muskets, but this is where the firearms and military hardware of the Europeans goes from, breech loading, excuse me. In the span of 1700, 1800, you will have not a lot of major fire or weaponry improvements. You'll have generally muskets get a little bit better. You have better turns of rifling, and you have the evolution of 2-deckers to 3-deckers, which are major ships of the line at the time. Very big ships, don't get me wrong, and the Chinese couldn't compete with that anyway. But the problem is, one, there's a limited supply of these things because they take like 20 years to build, and they're incredibly expensive. But on top of that, is that basically the land and sea powers is that China can hold everybody off because the Europeans can't bring enough force to bear. But because of the industrial revolution that is now going on in Europe, the Europeans now have incredible force multipliers that are rapidly going to start setting in. And so you will have at the start basically muskets, but then rapidly you'll get breech loading muskets into mini balls. Wes, I not only did it on Twitch, I posted it up in the Discord and on Twitch, or on, and on Twitter. So, sorry. Anyway, going forward, Europeans start showing up in massive numbers, and of course this is largely going to be the British. And what they do is that they have new technologies that are absolutely going to let them outgun the Chinese in a major way. And it just doesn't go well for China. Now, this largely gets into 1849, and this is called the Opium Wars, and there's a few of them, but the first one's the big one. What largely sets this up is what we're talking about with trade, is that India is the major producer of tea, which is actually a spice. But anyway, major producer of tea, and they export it to Britain. And Britain loves the tea, right? There's the memes are real. Problem. The Qing will only accept silver as a payment for that, and they won't import anything from the wider world. And it gets to a point where Britain is openly losing crap tons of money. They're on track within 10 years that they will run out of silver to use as a currency because it's all going to China. And this is causing massive problems within London itself. And the reason why this is the British, not anybody else, is that the British largely are, because they're in India, they already have a base of operations to get closer to China in a major way. You do have the Dutch and the French and a few other people that can get here, but they really won't get their empires up and running in Southeast Asia until the 1870s. So the Brits show up here first in force. Okay. So the Brits aren't very happy. And I feel sad that you disabled that. Anyway, I understand that, though. All right, going forward is that this gets into the point of a fight because the British aren't very happy. Now, what sets this up in the 1840s is that the British start openly smuggling and sponsoring people who are smuggling a particular substance that the Chinese really want, and they actually become the largest drug peddlers in world history. And this is, of course, Indian opium, because India has a crap ton of it that they've been trying to figure out what to do with, because everyone knows everyone knows even then opium is bad, but they're trying to like police it. Well, they figure out there's quite a few people that are addicted to opium within China, and they're able to start smuggling in and start making back money that they've been losing from trade with China because the Queen wouldn't let it. They openly start smuggling drugs. Britain might have done something incredibly unethical here, but, you know, all's fair in love and war, I guess. Anyway, so, don't fuck with people and their money. That's basically the moral of this story. Britain is upset, so they start peddling drugs, and it gets worse and worse and worse because the British are really damn good at it, and they're really good at sponsoring people who they find that are good at it. And so year after year, the British are able to help funnel in more and more and more opium to where northern India becomes an opium factory to sell into the Chinese market so that the British can recoup their losses. And it works really well. One of the more darker areas of history, especially for Britain, but in a general sense, is that while they are massive drug peddlers, they're able to reverse the economic fortunes that are going on between the imbalance of the Queen and the British. And believe me, I'm not taking sides in this fight. You can't openly say, you know, here, buy all my stuff, but I'm not going to buy any of yours. That's not a good relationship. And I talk about that quite a lot today. So, anyway, going forward is that eventually this all comes to a head where there's British citizens that are arrested because they're getting caught, or there are numerous people that they're sponsoring that are getting caught, and it comes to a head. Now, there's a long conversation where how this all breaks down. But in general, what happens is that the British get pissed, the Queen get pissed, and it eventually erupts into a war. Problem for the Queen. The British aren't the Europeans of yesteryear. The Queen and the Chinese are very much this idea that while the Europeans are from a faraway land, they don't have the ability to really force the issue. And so this is the Queen's domain. They're not used to the new paradigm with the new European weapons and the British ruling India to a large degree. And so, almost at the same time that the Sepoy Rebellion is going to fire off in India, you have the Chinese more or less force the issue, and the British will finish the issue. And they'll show up. And these are not necessarily ironclads, but you have the first... You have what is used to be old gunpowder cannons, right? And even with three-deckers, they are way more powerful than the Chinese junks. But at this time, you're starting to see the advent of what are breech-loading rifled guns that, while they're very more primitive than what we can find, 50 years down the road, is that these are radical improvements that are showing... radical revolutionary improvements in how the Europeans make weapons that reload faster, the more accurate, and they're a lot easier to contain explosive shots. And so the British Navy, the Royal Navy, largely shows up off of a bunch of trading ports outside of southern China, and they openly just start going at it with the Chinese Navy. And the Chinese Navy's huge. They've got a lot of these ships that are called junks. They're basically the equivalent of high-speed frigates that the Europeans would be using at the time. But the difference here is that the Europeans, after centuries and centuries of conflict between each other, have gotten really goddamn good at war, particularly the Royal Navy in fighting on the seas. The Chinese are absolutely outgunned physically, but also just outdoctrined because they're not experienced with dealing with this in a real big way. And so the Chinese Navy is just rapidly and quickly defeated in short order, even though it is large and numerous. And the British start shelling the living crap out of Chinese coastal cities. That's bad enough. And then the Queen don't look like they're going to surrender because while the Navy's there, they don't think that the British Army can actually force anything. And so they literally actually try to attrition the British out because they're like, eventually they're just going to run out of ammunition, which is probably true because Europe is quite a ways away. And even their supply bases in India are about 3,000 miles away. So anyway, going forward with this, That's funny. I'm not a socialist. But anyway, going forward is that the Chinese are kind of waiting for the British to just, the Chinese are waiting for the British to largely run out of attrition of ammunition, and then they'll just be like, all right, cool, you're done. What happens is that the British send in a number of their Marines, and I think it's like 10,000 British Marines. It might not even be that much. But they have, muskets, and eventually you'll get into this time is that they have the first breech-loading weapons, and I can't remember what the British version is, but it's very akin to like the Prussian needle gun at this point. Not exactly like that, but it's on the same kind of level of caliber that we're talking here, is that they operate in a very similar level. And so higher rates of fire, higher rates of accuracy, and what they're able to do is that they're able to come in and siege a major city in China. It's the biggest city in southern China, and I apologize, I can't remember what the city's name is, but it's quite a bit upriver, and it's the capital of southern China writ large. They're able to come in, and against innumerable odds, which we have no idea how many were actually even there, the Chinese just get absolutely slaughtered by 10,000 British soldiers. And the British are able to literally come in and sack the city. And this is largely where the Qing kind of lose all ability, or no, what is it? It's not all ability, it's all respect in the population to win the war, because at every single point, they're outnumbered, physically they're outnumbered, and they keep getting their asses kicked. And eventually by, I think it's like 1853, the Chinese are largely forced to sue for peace. They have to or the Qing have to pay a massive indemnity of some given amount, basically pretty much all the silver that they had gotten for the last 10 years, they have to pay back, just writ large, on top of the fact that they now have to allow open access to European traders. And what is kind of screwy from the British is that the Chinese now have to openly let opium into the country. So not only this, the British largely enforce trade rights, and they actually openly enforce that European citizens here are above the law, or above Chinese law. They're only subject to British law. There is an established area, which obviously will eventually become Hong Kong, but you'll have a few other areas such as Macau, among others, that are turned into European trade cities and trade zones that Europeans basically start running the show. That is because Europe is superior. That's kind of a loaded statement. In some ways, yes. In some ways, no. You have to quantify that. I was just talking about the weapons that we were talking about. Just absolutely insane. Okay. Moving forward is that first Opium War, the Europeans win, obviously, or if you will, the British win, and absolutely just knock the Qing out. And you'll eventually have other European countries start forcing the issue and coming in. You'll have other European countries start rolling in and kind of forcing the issue themselves, and the Qing lose a lot of respect from their own populace because they're not able to stave off the Europeans, and the Europeans are literally able to have their own law supersede Chinese law in China, and it absolutely pisses everyone off. And it puts everyone on the back foot. We'll be talking about Japan next. And Japan history is that at this point, this is where Japan has, what is his name? Matthew Perry show up. And Japan had just learned about what was going on within China at this point, and Japan doesn't want that to happen. So you'll have the Meiji Restoration and all that go off at the same time. But China's not able to do that. China's not able to bring in Westerners, because where the Japanese are able to have a civil war that eventually leads them into adopting a lot of Western principles and a lot of Western technology and embracing technological diffusion and basically the reforms that they need to do to have their own East Asian version of the European Revolution, is that China doesn't have this. They get ever more xenophobic, they get ever more locked down and totalitarian, and so they don't have these revolutions, both socially, technologically, that allows them to embrace these newfound technologies that are coming into their country and just beating the crap out of them. And so slowly by surely, you will have the eroding of the Qing Empire's authority to the point where a lot of coastal cities become free trade zones for the Europeans. You'll have the Germans in Tsingtao, you'll have Hong Kong, you have Macau, you've got a couple of other places throughout where Shanghai is pretty much, there's an entire sector of Shanghai that is largely the foreign quarter, where it's largely a European embassy. And it's not weird because it's like the Americans are there, the Canadians are there, the British are there, the Germans are there, the French are there, the Portuguese are there, the Spanish are there. Anyone who could put a boat into the water can live there and operate it. And it largely is subject to what we call European laws and not Chinese law. And this is just for Shanghai being one of the most prosperous and beautiful cities within China, this is an affront to many Chinese nationals they can't stand. Eventually, what happens is two things. One, the Japanese start doing very well for themselves, and you'll have the Sino-Japanese War, the first one, where Japan just openly shows that they can embrace this new technology, and they absolutely wipe the floor with the Chinese. They will annex Korea, and they will annex Taiwan in short order from this war, and it's an absolute blowout, which is kind of quite hilarious. I'll read that here in just a second. But in a general sense, is that China's getting absolutely manhandled by not only the Europeans now, but by pretty much everybody around them. And their authority is pretty much at peak crisis, and it goes into the late 1870s and 80s where you have Japan beat them, and then the Qing are trying to hold on, but then World War I happens, and the Europeans are literally fighting in China between each other over what is going on. Particularly Japan is trying to take over German colonies like Tsingtao in China, and then eventually you will have what is the Boxer Rebellion among a few other rebellions, which are just these continuous nationalist uprisings to get the foreigners out and restore basically the principles and authority of China. This is convoluted. I'm skipping over like 20 years of history really quick here, but one, I don't know everything in order, but you'll have about 3 major rebellions fire off within 20 to 25 years that absolutely, while not winning, will destroy China as a functional entity from within the inside. And so by the time you get to the end of World War I, China literally just implodes again, just very similar to what we had seen the Ming do. What the problem here going forward is that China starts trying to make reforms, but it goes into another warring states period. And you'll have some warlords and some cliques, as they call it, that are gravitated outside of the Chinese core, and then you'll have some other people within the Chinese core trying to unify some kind of new entity. What largely does happen is a guy named Sun Yat-sen is able to build, in some regards, what we call the modern Republic of China. And this will eventually lead to the Republic of Taiwan today, which is the Republic of China. He forms a Western-style democratic country that tries to embrace liberal principles and liberal ideals and to gain the technological diffusion that they need to get European technology to be able to counter the Europeans and build a sovereign state. It largely goes pretty well until he dies in 1926, if I remember right. And the problem is that the person who replaces him is not the idealist that Sun Yat-sen is. There's a little bit of a power struggle that goes on, but the guy that eventually takes over is a guy named Chiang Kai-Shek. And he is a general. He is literally the generalissimo, as a lot of Westerners would refer to him at the time. And so there's no one who's really a liberal reformer within China. With the nationalist Chinese, which is what they're referred to at this point, is nationalist China being the core government, you will have a splintering of all these different ideologies between like liberals and people that are more like stern conservative militarists, and then you get people that are like crazy out like communists, actually, which is the rise of Mao Zedong that comes up in this era. And so going into the late 1920s and the early 1930s is that you will have basically China in more or less a state of like weird flexing civil war. Sooner or later, sometimes the cliques just say, hey, look, this is my territory, this is your territory, we're not going to deal with this. The Republic of China, the government, the Republic of China, largely is trying to force the issue on some people. They'll largely beat the communists to a large degree, and the communists will flee on the Long March, which is a 6,000-mile long march all the way around China. And they'll build up in the hinterlands and become warlords themselves. in the hinterlands of Sinaxi. Problem. The core government is simply not having the reforms that they need to really bring in the renovations that they need, because they're nowhere near as liberal and they're a lot more xenophobic, unlike what they had under Sun Yat-sen. And the other side of this is that Chiang Kai-Shek is not a visionary. He's very much in league with all the other warlords of the time. And so while he rules a more modern state in what is China at this point, the apostructure, if you will, is largely very similar to everything else that's going on in China. And so they're not able to separate themselves. They're not able to bring in foreign investment. They're not able to bring in foreign technology in a way that really benefits them. And the only time that the Chinese can really get help is largely when Japan starts coming in again, and they get help from the West to oppose Japanese interests. And so I guess we'll jump to there. What happens in 1931 is that Japan invades the province of Manchuria. We've talked about that quite a lot, but this is where the Manchu people are from. That's that northeast corner of China proper. And they openly just come in and they annex it. And the hilarious part is that it was not even a government-sanctioned event. The Japanese army just says screw it and rolls in themselves. And this actually is one of the things that leads to the collapse of the civil government within Japan into more of a military junta. But that's the Japanese episode coming up next. But anyway, where we're at with China here is that in 1931, Manchuria is invaded and it's basically turned into a puppet state called Manchu Kuo, led by, unironically, the last Qing emperor, who was 3 years old when he had to advocate the throne. And they put him back on, but he's only a figurehead. But it's just kind of a claim to utility. In 1937, you have the Marco Polo Bridge incident. That is a preamble for the Japanese invading. And to a large degree, what eventually happens is that Japan just outright invades in China in full. They'll largely sweep in from the north, from their not puppet state, what's the word here? Their puppet state, their enclave that is in China. They'll flood into Beijing, which is really right next to the border, and they'll pull all the way down into Shanghai, and they'll get into Nanking. And then, of course, in 1938, you had the Nanking, the massacre at Nanking, where like 250,000 to 300,000 Chinese citizens are just slaughtered in what is one of the most brutal instances of civilian conflict and war. And this is largely just to show the Chinese from the Japanese viewpoint that they're in charge and we are not to be questioned. History. At the same time, you have China also getting invaded from numerous fronts because the Japanese have naval superiority. And so any area that the Japanese want to lock down, they'll send in the Imperial Marines to come and take over. And so any islands that are off the coast, they'll start there and they'll start working their way up into different parts of China. Most of China will be largely occupied by 1939. In the regards of the coastal regions. And what largely happens is that the entirety of the Chinese core is occupied. Most of the hinterland regions is the places that Japan is not able to conquer, because for the geography being as problematic as for the Chinese, it's even worse for the Japanese because they don't live there. And so the one thing that China does have going for it at this point is that China is able to unify under their very ethno-nationalist lens that fuck the Japanese. And so you have the communists, the nationalists, and all the other warlords. If they haven't been conquered, they are actively in now an open alliance to repel the Japanese from their country. And they are all largely working in tandem, more or less, to do that. And so what will largely happen is that Japan starts to stagnate in China. And they'll make a little bit of gains over the course of the entire war, but even by 1945, at the end of the war, they will very seldomly ever get forced back into retreat, but they're not able to conquer all of China. And it's really weird, because like literally at one point, what we think of as China at that time, half of it's occupied by Japan when the treaty is signed in the war. So Japan hasn't been invaded yet. It's only been nuked twice, but was occupying Korea, but the Soviets started showing up within the last month. They just lost Manchuria within the last month because the Soviets invaded, but most of mainland China still occupied, still surrendering. And that's largely because the Allies, and particularly the Soviets, are able to force the issue. It's just like, there's no way you can win. And China will largely fall to the Soviet influence within the better part of a year, and everyone knows it. So Japan scoops, calls it quits. Just to elaborate further a little bit, the reason why Japan can't conquer the area is one, there's a massive amount of resistance, but two, they're not able to police the interior of the country outside of where the railroads are. So what the Japanese plan to conquer the area is that they need to control the infrastructure to build out to control modern China. The problem is modern China at that point didn't have the infrastructure to become a modern state that we needed, and that was the problems that the reforms that they were trying to pull off under Sun Yat-sen was that they didn't get fired off, is that you need roads, you need rail, you need all this to really turn China from a feudalistic society into something that we think of today. And that is what the communists will eventually be able to do, more so in the 1980s, but we'll get there. Talking about the Middle Kingdom, we're actually getting more towards the end here, but been talking about China. So, going forward, in a nutshell, is that Japan withdraws and China is left divided because while the communists were on the back foot, the Soviets were able to rule into Manchuria and into the areas of Inner Mongolia during the last month of the war when they forced the peace. And of course, who do they give that land to? They don't keep it, they give it to the communist forces within China. And so all of a sudden, the communists are completely revitalized in a massive way. And then the Civil War starts pretty much right back up even before the official war ends in World War II. And so you have largely what is pockets of northern China, and particularly the northeast corridor of China, largely up to the communists, and then southern and central China is largely up to the nationalists. The nationalists go on the offensive in 1945, and by 1947 they've taken over they control about 2/3 to 3/4 of modern China. And the communists are absolutely on the back foot. The Soviets realize this, and they start shipping massive arms and ammunition to the communists to kind of revitalize them. At the same time, the nationalist Chinese are losing any and all support from the West because they don't really want to be involved in a civil war, and they're not really paying attention to Chiang Kai-Shek because no one really likes him. The West is not particularly fond of Chiang Kai-Shek, and they were largely just there to oppose Japanese interests. Well, they kind of lose the plot in opposing the communists, and so within the period of 47 to 49, the communists just go on a full counterattack, and largely going into 1948, the communists just go on a full offensive, and they'll be able to steamroll the Chinese or the nationalist Chinese to the point where nationalist China and the Kuomintang, which is basically the name for nationalist China, flees to Taiwan, and communist China is now the People's Republic of China that we see today. They take over the entire country, and they'll actually go into the hinterlands that are the warlord states and the splinter states such as Yunnan, Xinjiang, and Tibet, and they're able to conquer it all by 1950. This is a shock to pretty much everybody but the Soviets because the Soviets knew exactly what they were doing. The West wasn't paying attention and got caught with their pants down, and basically China enters the communist bloc in a large and fundamental way very, very quickly, and it scares the hell out of everybody. To flex their muscle at the same time, just to show that the communists are no joke, you have Korea erupts in July of 1950 as a war between the North and the South. The UN comes in largely as an aegis of the Americans and the Allies to oppose them. You'll have Soviet weapons and sponsoring, but they won't be openly involved. But come late 1950, North Korea is about to be defeated because they're going up against a superpower. China will join in, and they will send 400,000 troops across the Yalu in one day to repel the Allies, and they will get absolutely bodied in numbers. But even with that, is that because they are now supplied with Soviet weapons and munitions, they are able to be a competent fighting force in some degree. And so even if they're getting bodied 3-1, 5-1, or maybe even 10-1, we're not quite sure, the Chinese are able to help push back the Allies, and they'll push them all the way back down 2/3 down the peninsula. Eventually, the Allies will counterattack, and this is, of course, where MacArthur's like, "We're gonna nuke China," and he gets fired by Truman. what eventually happens is that after the better part of 1951, late 1951, the war turns into a stalemate. The Chinese are not able to push any harder than what they're able to because they're feeding them into the meat grinder. The Soviets won't get involved because it looks like nuclear war would break out. And the Americans are no longer willing to force the issue because they're afraid that if they have to push forward, they're going to have to start dropping nukes. So, what largely kind of boils down here is that come 1953, the war ends in stalemate. We get modern North Korea and South Korea, and communist China is now in charge. I'm going to look over chat real quick because there was some stuff that I've been missing, and I apologize. I just, I haven't had a chance to really go over it because I was trying to train of thought. So, remind me, we're at the end of Korea, and we're in 1953 because a lot happens in 1953. In the 1800s, the British expansion in Asia, like China, Korea, Japan, is when the existing xenophobia gets turned up to 15 because of the economic and cultural contamination from the British. I don't disagree with that. That's largely true. And it's largely when you get into like the Opium Wars and stuff that the xenophobia gets to like level 10 because not only are these other people, but they're other peoples that are invaders. And this is not a good thing because China in Chinese is Zhongguo, and that means the Middle Kingdom. They literally, through all of their history, have thought of themselves as the center of the world, more or less. The Middle Kingdom translating into that. And so they're not used to playing by somebody else's rules ever in their history. It's always Chinese forcing Chinese rules upon themselves. And now all of a sudden they have somebody who is influencing them and absolutely manhandling them. This, of course, is the century of humiliation that largely starts with the Opium Wars in 1849, and it will end in 1949 with the unification of China under the communists. A little bit of a PR stunt, let's be honest here, but largely what happens, and the reason why they're able to say this, is that they openly are getting bodied by the Europeans starting in 1849, but after 1949, the European influence within China largely is just destroyed because the communists are not playing games, and they're able to have a massive sponsor under the Soviet Union that is able to put that forward. And so I kind of wanted to reiterate on that because I didn't really finish that point. I vote for nuking China, revenge for Genghis Khan wiping out Europe in the 1200s. That makes no sense. Genghis, or Temujin, otherwise known as Genghis Khan, is Mongolian. And actually, the Chinese are really fucking on the Mongolians right now. Half of Mongolia is within China. There's Outer Mongolia, which is now currently the Republic of Mongolia. And there is Inner Mongolia, which is a major autonomous province within China. And there's more Mongolians that live there than there is in actual Mongolia. So, shit. The Soviets were there at the end of World War II. I don't know where there is, but the Soviets would largely be in northern Korea and northern and northeastern China come the end of World War II because they invaded the area because it was occupied by Japan. I'm pretty sure they qualify as internal security struggles. Unironically, yes, that's kind of the meme, is that before the century humiliation, Chinese history is largely China versus China. And there's very few times where somebody who isn't China coming in, of course you have the Mongols, you have what we think may be the Hans, or not the Hans, the Huns, among a few other people, but at least to a large degree, either China is able to repel them, or in the case of the Mongol rulers of China, is that they're largely able to rule them, or they're basically usurp them. And that is... Okay, this is really weird, but I gotta remake this. Half of the rulers of China were not Han Chinese. They were like Manchus or one of the other like principal peoples that lived in the borderland regions that were able to come in during an era of instability in China and kind of come in and conquer it. But they all largely saw each other, even though not directly as Han Chinese, as to some degree as Chinese. And so, or at least they're Chinese-like. But when Europe shows up and they're from another continent, and of course they look different completely, that is an existential threat to the Chinese ego that absolutely breaks down. And this is a massive thing in their history to this very day. I have openly said this, that China has an inferiority complex. And that is built into the Chinese psyche because for years and years and years, for literally centuries, if not millennia, China's been the center of the world in their history. And then all of a sudden, with over 100 years, they absolutely get bitched by the Europeans. And it's something that just bothers them immensely. And it's something that they have yet to even recover from psychologically as a nation, because this is not what happens to the center of the world. The center of the world controls you, not the other way around. And they've had to reconcile that, because that was basically an existential crisis that China's had to deal with, and they've never really identified how to handle that as basically being part of a greater world. They just cognitive dissonance. Excuse me. Kim Il-sung was very possibly might have been democratically elected, and the U.S. just wasn't cool with protecting Japan, with the whole continent being communist. I don't know if Sung would have been elected, but if you had allowed open elections in all of Korea, Sung might have been. He was pretty popular, even though he was communist. Is that he was one of the major resistance fighters within Japan, during the Japanese occupation. He was kind of seen as a national hero. The problem is that the United States was never going to openly support a communist or allow that. And so you basically get the Republic of Korea and the Democratic People's Republic of Korea. And then we already talked about the Opium Wars, so I'm not going to do that. I don't know anything about the Bath Wars. Okay, back to 1953. A truce is signed in Korea in 1953. We talked about that. But another thing that happens in 1953 that completely stirs the plot is that Stalin, who's leader of the Soviet Union, dies. And China and the Soviet Union start going into the Sino-Soviet Split. And it's hilarious, because literally the Soviets had just sponsored China's rise to power with the communists in China. And as soon, just a couple years afterward, what happens is that Moscow's like, hey, we got a new leader now. He's in charge. And Mao in China's up like, no, I'm now arch communist. You listen to me. And so there's a falling out between the Soviets, or the Russians, if you will, and the Chinese, because they don't agree on who's basically the arch communist and who should be listened to. You eventually have the Sino-Soviet Split, which is in a large regard over the 1950s, where the Chinese and the Soviets go from allies to kind of like acquaintances, to openly bitter, to openly hostile to each other's actions and desires. And it will be a major focal point for both of their foreign policies within Asia, is containing the other. And it actually helps the West considerably in maintaining the balance of power. Is that having the Chinese and the Soviets not on the same playing field is an absolute win for the West, because that means that they're putting a lot of resources into containing each other and containing each other's influences and not opposing Western influence. And of course, this leads into eventually the Chinese flipping, with Nixon going to China in 1971. The problem that largely happens within China that leads to this is that over the 60s, you have... I can't remember. It's like the Red Book, the Red Book Revolution, all this. Mao gets a bunch of kids hyped up on communism and the principles of communism and social justice and all this shit. And he goes around just breaking everything and killing a bunch of people. And this is largely like 2/3 of his body count. Yes, Cultural Revolution. Yes. Hey, we haven't seen you in quite a while. It's good to see you, buddy. I thought you were done with Twitch. I'm sorry I pulled all your stuff, like VIP and whatnot. I just thought you were done. But good to see you. Anyway, where I'm going with this is that China has a real problem, because they're not able to build out the modern infrastructure the way they have. And of course, they go through this massive cultural revolution that gets a lot of people killed, and it's one of the biggest famines in all of human history. It's the biggest famine in human history as far as scale, and as far as absolute numbers. As far as scale, it's like the third. Something on the order of like 70 million, 80 million Chinese die, and it's part of Mao's like 100 million body count that comes in with this. Over the 1960s is horrible for China. Eventually Mao dies, and I can't remember what year he dies, but I think it's like 73. But largely, as he's going out, he realizes that everybody hates him, and it's not a good deal for China. And so the people under him start making overtures to find an international sponsor to help them figure out how they're going to go forward. And of course, they don't like the Soviets, and they've had a bad relationship, and so they actively start looking at the Americans as a possible friend. Think about it in this context. China is not a major power in a lot of regards. While they are large and sizable, we're talking about an economy that is in the billions when the Americans are in the trillions. The Soviet Union outclipses the Chinese economy and the Chinese standard of living by like a factor of 5, and the Americans by a factor of 10. China's just in the shit. And so what China largely does is that they start making overtures to the Americans. You have Nixon going to China, and this is largely the agreement that happens. They're not going to join NATO. They're not going to openly say that they're capitalist or anything. But what they're going to do is they're going to start liberalizing their economy, and they're going to start making overtures to be like this kind of intermediary bridge, which is they had a name for this, and I can't remember what it was, but China basically says, we're going to maintain the authoritarian measures, and maybe we'll let up on that later, but we're going to open up our economy to becoming part of the American-led world order because we'd rather be with the Americans than we would be the Soviets. And so this is a master plan by the Americans. Throughout the 1970s, not a lot happens here that's kind of laying the groundwork. Become the 1980s, is this when they transition to communist to fascist? It's the start. What largely happens is that they economically liberalize in a way that becomes like centrally planned and becomes state capitalist. Okay, that's the first time I've been compared to Chris Pratt. Usually it's Seth Rogen. But anyway, I'm gonna ignore that for a second. So going forward is that in Chinese history is that where were we? Okay, yeah, we're in the 70s. 70s doesn't really have a lot going on because the Chinese are trying to figure out how they're going to liberalize, what they're going to do. And it takes the better part of the 70s for Mao to die and for the reforms to start taking effect and the leaders who are going to replace Mao to come forward and start setting the agenda. Getting into the 1980s, though, this is where it all starts kicking off. And largely this is Chinese kind of leading off from the American example, actually. In the West, you have the Conservative Revolution. This is Maggie Thatcher. This is Ronald Reagan, and they are very much, not libertarians, but they're neoconservatives, and the neoconservatives believe in world free trade and not open borders, but free trade across the world, and that economic competition breeds a better world, and the Chinese kind of buy this, and the Americans are openly like, hey, look, you know what? We've got all these jobs that are going to end up getting automated, so you can have them. You're going to be on our side of the alliance. We'll help you develop. And so there becomes this plan. All the outsourcing that goes to Mexico and China, and eventually that will lead to the free trade deals that we're used to, is laid in the 1980s. And so, China starts industrializing. It's really slow at first, but they start laying the groundwork. They start laying out their plans. They start laying out how this is all going to go down and what point economic freedoms are labeled out, where they're labeled out, and how. And so this is the state capitalist mindset that China has built out, forming here at this point. And, where we are at this point is that the 1980s come to a close, and China is positioning itself to have this massive revolution industrially and economically. Problem. The entire point of this was to oppose the Soviet Union, right? Right. In 1989, the Eastern Bloc starts falling apart. 1990, Germany reunifies, and most of the communist puppet governments within the Eastern Europe fall apart. And of course, come the end of 1991, the Soviet Union bites the dust. So the Americans are now involved in this deal with China to help industrialize, revolutionize what is going to happen in China and the rest of the world. And there's no point in it anymore. But out of pure inertia, the Americans keep going with it anyway. And there's actually one reason why. Neoconservatives and neoliberals at this point, and to this very day, believe that if you give people an economic well-being, that will lead to the increased desire of freedom and liberty and democracy And this was the long-term plan to not only industrialize China, but to turn it into a major bastion of democratic principles, because basically the idea was is that once people got good jobs in China, where they became a modern economy and a modern nation in their regard, they would join the democracy club, because who with a good job doesn't want democracy? There was a problem with this. I've talked about this quite a bit, but I'm going to hash it out here because it's a really big thing. But definitely check out my episode on globalism, because I talk about it here as well. The problem was it was working. Throughout the 1990s, you have the formation of the Chinese stock market. First there's one, then there's another, and I think there's like 4 now. You have the major state institutions that are built out that help build out modern China. Of course, you have massive capital flight out of America and out of the Soviet Union that is able to help invigorate the Chinese economy, because people have assets that they want to invest in, and China starts taking off. This is where the growth curve on their economy starts going crazy. Getting in the 2000s, this is working out very well, and that the Chinese economy is growing at an exponential rate. It's like anywhere between 6 and 10% a year. Thank you for the follow again. For Wavy Break. Was it? Yeah, Wavy. Anyway. Excuse me. China is growing rapidly at this point, and there is a lot of reforms going on that looks very promising. We have the rise of some very strong democratic unions and democratic forces with underground newspapers and the like. That makes it look like China is on the path to doing exactly what the neoliberal and neoconservative mindset was. They're going to have democracy. They're going to have eventually a slow-rolling revolution that lets China join the modern era. As a free and open democratic republic that allows for multi-party democracy and economic freedom and a higher standard of living. Problem comes twofold. Number one is that China becomes the workshop of the world. And so they're able to give people, industrial jobs that either everyone else couldn't afford on a cost benefit analysis. This is why the West gets deindustrialized, is that a lot of this goes to China, India, what have you, and this is the brick boom as a large regard, is that China can just outcompete everybody on labor costs. So they get all the jobs that anyone else can't have. Number one, China has 1.4 billion people. At this point, I think it's like 1.1. So they've got more workers than they know what to do with. And so their labor costs are fanatically low for a very long time. And so literally any job that can go to China goes to China. On top of that is that they heavily subsidize their nation or their economic system, because it's not the same economic model. It is not a profit-driven model. It's a throughput-driven model. Their whole thing is keeping people employed, keeping the economic gears turning, and this is basically the rise of MMT and a few other things that are going on in the modern discourse politically. China's been doing it for 20 damn years, if not 30 at this point. Is that their whole idea is that if people have demand, people have jobs, we don't have to worry about the supply side economics, because the demand constantly generates supply. Not a terrible idea. I'm going to say this. I hate this whole argument, because this is a lot of modern left-leaning economists think, is that as long as you keep increasing demand, the supply will answer to it. To a large degree, that's been somewhat true, but there's a significant difference between what we're looking at in China versus what we're looking at the West, which is a lot of what these people want to do with UBI and shit, is that the problem with the West is that there's a rapidly higher ceiling, where the West is highly developed, technologically advanced, and people have radically higher incomes. And so getting the demand to go higher in the West is really hard, because we can already afford our PlayStations and our Xboxes and our cars and all this. Now, granted, that's a little bit of a problem going forward, but that's something of a conversation other. China doesn't have this problem, because you're literally starting at zero, where people can barely afford food in the 1970s and in the early 1980s in China. That's literally just food, housing, basic security. That is the Chinese citizens' basic needs and hierarchy of needs. That's all they can get to. Very few rich people in China, very few people that even qualify as middle class, and the vast majority of this country, that is 1.1 billion people, a billion of them, or at least 800 million of them, are in the old definition of poverty, which was at the time, and this is 1990 numbers, $2.50 a day. This is an incredibly impoverished nation that is absolutely in the process of going through a fundamental transformation. And so giving people jobs, giving people money to the point where you're going to have economic growth, it just takes off. And when the sky is basically the limit and you don't have to run into anything, because even today with all of this economic growth, the hard numbers is the average Chinese citizen has an income of $10,500 a year. And if you're talking about PPP, even if you max that out, it's $17,000 a year. So compared to the West, $40,000, $50,000, $60,000 a year income, they've still got a lot to go. They've still got a ways to go. So in a nutshell, the problem is that business model has been working for them. It won't work for us. Stop comparing us to them. But on the other side of that is what happened to the democratic revolution that was going on, where the advance of civil rights and all this stuff that was actually taking place in China got hard countered. What largely happened was two things. Again, number one is that we had the rise of the modern leadership under Xi Jinping, which he's a lot more unreserved compared to the former predecessors that were reformists. And he is now basically emperor or dictator for life. The other side of this is that what happened was that as all of these Chinese citizens got access to new toys and new consumer goods because they had the ability to afford them, is that they got cell phones and computers and all this stuff. But when we're talking about a country that doesn't have civil institutions and civil laws that makes you have a right to privacy or a right to free speech, what happened was twofold in the regards that, one, everyone was online and engaged, but everyone could be tracked by the internet. And this is the rise of the big data, and a lot of people don't believe me on this. I know that people just throw it off. The problem with the computer revolution is that back in the 2000s, it looked like it was the Brave New World. Anyone could talk to each other. We were going to have democracy and freedom everywhere because you couldn't stop it. Turns out it's exactly the opposite case, because what the Chinese government has been able to do is that anytime you're using your cell phone and you're like, hey, let's have a meeting tomorrow. The Chinese government sucks. Let's see if we can build out a political party. Let's make sure we're printing out our newspapers and everything, get spread out the word. Chinese government has the Chinese government has no qualifications or reservations in reading your stuff and showing up on your door to pay you a beating. And this is where the big data revolution that people are completely misunderstanding is going. Is that big data is not the internet, and big data is no longer the tool of the libertarian. It's the tool of the authoritarian. Because if you have no compunction about showing up people's doors and punching their face in when they say something you don't like, you can. And China from 2010, which was largely gearing up for what we thought was going to be a democratic revolution and a transition into a stable, functioning democracy, come 2020, all of these movements had died. Systematically had been put down by the Chinese central government. We can't find the newspapers anymore. These underground entities are just dead because the Chinese have no problem with policing their people in a way that is that social credit system that you may have heard of. They're literally just monitoring everything that you do. And because they now have the technology to do that with modern computers and AI and this, that, and the like, the things that the NSA would love to do to some of the American citizens, they openly do on a regular basis. China will never become a functioning democracy. Most nations that we keep trying to industrialize because we think that they're going to become major nations that are democratic, the neoconservative, neoliberal world order that prosperity breeds competence and democracy no longer works. It's been hard countered by big tech and big data. And that's the end of the game. So, China going forward, what are we looking at? China has some problems. We talked about this, where they're at today. The problems going forward with China is twofold. Number one, most of the resources that China needs to maintain this burgeoning economy is not within the Chinese geography itself. They got quite a lot, but the number one thing they have to worry about is oil. Oil is 7,000 miles away in the Persian Gulf. They have to figure out how to access that. And if anyone actually says no, they're in a world of hurt. That's going to be the number one thing the Chinese are going to be working on the next 10 years. Building out the relationship to get oil that they need and also being able to maintain it. They're going to be looking to build military bases, and they're looking to absolutely fuck over India in every way possible to maintain India not being a threat to their oil supplies. They're also going to be looking into how they can continually build out economic relationships that either allow them to basically usurp control within given countries. This is largely happening with sub-Saharan Africa. But also they're going to be looking to economically integrate their rivals and the people that don't necessarily like them into the fold where it's really hard for them to say no. This is largely what's happening in Australia. A lot of Australian exports are bought up by the Chinese. The Chinese are rapidly investing into Australian companies. They're basically trying to economically supplant the Australians to the point where China can just be like, hey, we run everything, so, if you don't really want to play ball with us, that's cool, but you fucked. The China's actually overplaying this. While there are liberal democracy, while there is a liberal democracy that is Australia, if the Australians want to suspend some of the rules of law, particularly when it comes to geopolitical interests, and the Americans are absolutely going to support them, they can largely just be like, oh, cool, we're going to nationalize you in the interest of state security. While that is a very taboo thing, even here in the United States and Australia, it will happen in the event that the Chinese force the issue, because geopolitics and national security always reign supreme. And if you ever look at Western democracies and how they function, if you openly risk their sovereignty, you're getting told off in a big fucking way, real quick. So anyway, going forward, China is looking to become a major geopolitical power and rival superpower to the Americans. There's just really two questions here. Number one, are they able to access what they need to maintain it? And number two, are they able to do it in a way that doesn't make Americans throw the hammer at them? Because the Americans still hold most of the cards, geopolitically speaking, to where if they really wanted to screw China up, they could. That window is closing, but it still exists, and the Chinese know it. And so that's largely going forward. What do I think is going to happen? Depending on who wins the next election here in the United States, if you have a very anti-China government, in which the Biden's not necessarily weak on China, but they're kind of kiting, if you will, is that if you actually have a government throw the brick at China, China's probably toast. It might actually go into systematic collapse. And there's also a few things domestically that could reinforce that. If they're not get the brick thrown at them, they will continue to grow geopolitically to the point where they will become a rival superpower. And sooner or later, the Americans are going to wake up one day and they're like, okay, Cold War II electric boogaloo is on. So either which way, the Americans are going to find that their future largely is the antithesis to China. Is it to the point... The question is largely writ large. The question is, will the Americans do it in time that they can absolutely remove China as a major player geopolitically or cripple them? Or will the Americans wait until they are a fundamental threat that they can't knock off in one swipe, and we're back to another Cold War? I can't answer that question because right now, all the numbers are going crazy, and because of COVID and a few other things. In some ways, it looks like the Chinese might collapse in on themselves. In other ways, it looks like they're going to be what industrializes sub-Saharan Africa. I don't know what's going to happen next, to be honest, but that's the options. So yeah, I'm going to hit the questions real quick, and we'll close this out as far as China, and then if the person who is still here all the way back that was wanting to talk about what was going on here in the United States, I can answer that off board. But let me just see if I find anything. She's pretty much a demagogue. She is pretty much a demagogue. He is scary, but he isn't Hitler. I strongly disagree with this. He's not like, oh, hey, we have to kill everyone and put them into death camps. He plays by a lot of the same rules. And he is now emperor for life, or dictator for life. And he has more power than the old emperors do. So, no. Not going to play that one. China makes a lot of pollution, but that's because they took manufacturing for developed nations so they could lower their emissions because China doesn't care about emissions. There's a little bit of truth to that, but moreover, it was just economic. A lot of that was more about just industrialization and price points. Is that the Western nations weren't willing to pay their workers what they wanted to, and so it was just easier for their companies to offshore and import the goods because paying somebody a pittance a day instead of paying your workers at home was just cheaper and easier, even shipping it across oceans. And so that's where it is. How's the Chinese water issues? China doesn't have much in the way of water issues outside of a few areas. Northern China has the Gobi Desert, which is always going to be a problem. But right now, if anything, they're having a flood. They've actually had this year more rain than they've had in quite a while. And instead of having droughts like we've seen in the western United States, they're now getting record levels of rainfall. And so water issues regarding that, not really a problem, although the general trend is something I need to investigate a little more. A lot of people are talking about Chinese water issues are not Chinese water issues. They're Indian water issues. What's largely going on is, what's largely going on here is that the Chinese are looking to dam the water tributaries in southern Tibet. That is the water control over the Ganges and the Indus River valleys in India, in Pakistan. If China absolutely thinks this is if China actually thinks to go through with this is a war level action. And these are two nuclear powers. And India will absolutely throw nukes over water rights. There is no question in my mind. Nukes are on the table here. You cannot shut off a major country's water supply and not have anything go wrong. Of course, there's going to be a lot of conversations like, oh, China, we're just trying to build hydroelectric power. It's where no one lives. Everyone knows exactly what this is, and the Indians will not play ball with this, particularly if it's Modi in charge. Modi will openly go to war with China just to stir up national fervor and sentiment, and that puts us in a major geopolitical confluence point because while India is not equipped to deal with China on land and air to a large degree, they can absolutely wreck the Chinese in the sea because most of the Chinese Navy cannot get to India, and all of China's oil runs right next to India. So while India probably can't force China out of Tibet, they can probably shut down China as a functioning entity. So holy crap, that doesn't go well. Let's try to catch up here. I guess organ harvesting isn't cool. I sure hope not. I like to urge Aussies by saying Australia is a Chinese colony. China collapsing would be devastating in the world economy. In some ways, yes, but in some ways, no. We largely saw with COVID is that, yes, it will hurt the world economy, but this is one of those things that's actually encouraging the West to reindustrialize and actually think about their own national security in a major fundamental way. That's going to be a major conversation going forward because if your workers are consistently wanting to riot because they don't have because they don't have wages anymore, maybe it's better to have the jobs and be more protectionist. And of course that's a bit of my bias leaking forward, but that's going to be a huge conversation in the West, is getting out of Chinese influence and having a more domestic economy. Let's see. I think normal people on both sides are waking up now. That might be true. Previously describe the current state of the PLA, not just the military, but also the PLA holdings of corporations. I actually answered that in the last episode, and that will be out tomorrow on the YouTube. So definitely check that out, Viceroy Xerxes. Appreciate that. Sorry, I largely already answered it. It's because they control the Chinese media. Okay. I support China over the U.S. I greatly await the Marxist-Leninist revival in America. You are going to be sadly mistaken, because especially with China, because they're not Marxist-Leninists, they're fascist. They might say they're Marxist-Leninists, but they're not. Do you think he's going to be a state premier for life? I kind of feel like China looks for a stable internal revolution. Yeah, he's locked in now at this point. He's not gonna give it up. She is looking at existential crisis that the Chinese have to deal with, and he wants to maintain a solid, continuous leadership that holds it together for as long as he possibly can until he can actually feel like he can pass it off, which is probably unlikely, or that he dies in office and somebody else can take his place and continue a very much one-man rule. We are back to the era of dictatorship and emperors in China, and that's not going away anytime soon. Himalayan water issues. Some of these comments are stupid. I remember seeing videos that their big dam was a major collapse. Yes, it actually overfilled. I don't think it went over, but it actually got pushed to its max and a little bit past that. It held together, but it was not looking well for them. What happened is the water just flowed over the top. Okay, I didn't see that it actually got over the top. I'd have to check out that video, but thanks for clarifying that, West Dude. Sure, okay. Is religion and culture ethics if it's Chinese? I don't know how to answer that. That's a weird question. Recycling directly funds the PLA. There's actually a little bit of truth to that. Chinese Navy has changed a bit in the last 3 months. If you haven't been staying up to date on Worthing checking back, they were turning out a battleship a day for a while there. No one builds battleships anymore. What? Okay. Oh, Corvettes. Okay. I mean, Corvettes are Corvettes. They're not that good, and the problem is most Corvettes are green water or brown water ships. What China needs is they've got a huge green water navy. They don't have a blue water navy, and that's a massive problem. And I will be closing this out in about 4 minutes, regardless, because we're almost at an hour and a half. The U.S. Coast Guard has a larger medium tonnage than the Chinese Navy. Not necessarily true. Yeah, anyway, long story short here is that the Chinese Navy is huge. It's actually the biggest Navy in the world. The problem is that most of the Chinese Navy is a bunch of small ships that are green water capable and not blue water capable. And so for the Chinese Navy, the big transition is going to have a doctrine and, it's also going to be, it's largely going to have to be a doctrine change, and it's also going to be a mechanical, functional, practical change into becoming a Navy that can go 3,000 miles away from home and deal with any adversary or threat that they have to deal with. They don't have practice with aircraft carriers. They don't have practice with modern destroyers and submarines and all that stuff. And a lot of their technology is kind of just handy-downs from the Soviets. A lot of their newer stuff is only now just coming online, and we don't know how good it is. Okay, what was your general take on the stream? I missed it. I'll answer that here. Just in a quick measure after the recording is over. So we'll do the outro and whatever. U.S. tonnage is several times that of China. I'm looking at different numbers than you are. China has more tonnage and more ships, but they can't get away from their shoreline. So I don't know. Maybe you're talking about blue. If you're talking about blue water tonnage, absolutely. But if we're talking about green water tonnage, no. Oh, thank you, Mylan. I'll definitely take a look at that. Okay, so I'm going to close this out here. We'll do an AMA afterward because there was somebody that wanted to ask a really sensitive topic question. I hope that person is still here. But anyway, the stream is not ending. I'm just going to roll the outro for the YouTube and finish out the recording. And we'll get into the AMA afterward, and we can talk about all this other stuff. Anyway, I've been Tyberius D. I hope you guys on the YouTube have enjoyed this, and if you want, feel free to join the chat. Come involve. You can definitely tell that as the stream gets more prominent, we get the viewership. We also get the chatters. So we'd love to have you here on the live recordings, and you can interact with me. Please don't troll me to the point where I'm dealing with you, but you can definitely feel free to ask questions and get live stream updates regarding what's going on. And we are trying to establish a new schedule that is 11 p.m. Eastern Standard Time most nights here on Twitch. So hopefully we can hold to that. No promises, because that's always really hard for me. Without further ado, I hope you guys have enjoyed on the YouTube and Twitch. I'll be right back. Have a good one, guys.